We're on time with the tariffs, and it seems like that's moving along very rapidly. We've been mistreated very badly by many countries, not just Canada and Mexico.
On time means March 4th for Canada. That's
net exporter of fentanyl to Canada, a net exporter of illegal guns to Canada, and a net exporter of illegal migrants coming to Canada.
We were led by, in some cases, fools. If I look at some of these agreements, I'd read them at night and I'd say, who would ever sign a thing like this?
yes.
All we want is reciprocal. We want reciprocity. We want to have the same. So if somebody charges us, we charge them. It's very simple.
Trump represents the greatest threat to Canada since World War II. What we need today is allies, and we have to find them and work with them.
Canada will never, ever be part of the U.S.
We have to understand that Canada has a lot to offer the world, but we have to help businesses to diversify from the U.S. and to enter into these new markets.
80% of our trade goes towards exports go to the United States. That's why I propose a new economic bloc that would gather Canada, United Kingdom, Australia, and New Zealand.
Economic consequences of a protracted trade conflict would be severe, but it would be very different, a very different shock than the COVID-19 shock. In the pandemic, we had a steep recession followed by a rapid recovery as the economy reopened. This time, if tariffs are long-lasting and broad-based, there won't be a bounce back. We may eventually regain our current rate of growth, but the level of output will be permanently lower. It's more than a shock. It's a structural change.
All four candidates, as they did throughout the entire 2 hours, were largely in agreement on how they would approach this. Were they chosen as Liberal leader and then as Prime Minister, all denouncing Hamas, the October 7th attacks, calling for the release of Israeli hostages, but ultimately looking forward to a two-state solution. So Mark Carney was encapsulating his position and said that everyone on the stage, he said this in French, was in agreement with Hamas. He meant to say, of course, about or on Hamas. French is not Carney's first language.
So it's not, I'm not proposing for one moment that we'll work with Hamas.
We all agree on Hamas, on a two-state
No, we don't agree with
solution.
Hamas. No, we're against
Yes,
Hamas,
we're all against
absolutely.
Hamas. We are.
I said that we all were in agreement against Hamas, or at least the intention. And I have to be clear, to be absolutely clear, and I began my response with respect to the Middle East about the fundamental issue that all the hostages have to be returned to their families. And of course, Hamas has no place ever in any future discussion.
MPs and Conservative strategists were jumping on that remark. Some of them making it sound like he actually agreed with Hamas. Of course, that's not what he meant. He just kind of misspoke himself, chose the wrong preposition. Others, though, saying this raises a real concern about Carney's ability to communicate in French. Of course, prime ministers should be bilingual, and this is obviously an area of weakness. I think Conservatives, though, secretly happy about this because it suggests that Pierre Poilievre, who is fluently bilingual, speaks very good French, would have a real advantage in an election campaign debate against Carney in French. So I think the Carney camp is going to really apply itself until that point to really improve his French. It was clearly a stumble. Obviously, he doesn't agree with Hamas. None of the candidates do. But some Conservatives then made it sound like that on social media. Lots of tweets, people saying, oh, Mark Carney agrees with Hamas. He clearly didn't mean that. But this is obviously an area of vulnerability for him.
The first thing we would see is a marked decline in exports. As Canadian goods become more expensive, U.S. demand for those goods would decline. A lower Canadian dollar would provide a partial offset. In our model, with the scenario based on the February 1 executive order, exports fall by about 8.5% in the year after tariffs takes effect. That's the green line. Canadian exporters respond by cutting production and laying off workers. With exports to the United States accounting for roughly 1/4 of our national income, the shock will be felt across Canada. Lower export revenues would reduce household income, and retaliatory tariffs would raise the prices of many consumer goods. As a result, consumer spending on everything from cars to entertainment to housing would slow. With export and consumer demand weakening, Canadian businesses would also cut their investment spending, and higher costs and lower profit margins would restrain investment further. With retaliatory tariffs on some goods and a lower Canadian dollar, businesses will face higher import costs. Canadian businesses, and I'm looking at them, buy roughly half of their machinery and equipment from the United States. So what would this all mean for economic growth? Well, in our January projection with no tariffs, we forecast growth of about 1.8% in both 2025 and 2026. But in the tariff scenario, the level of Canadian output falls almost 3% over 2 years. That's the blue line. That implies tariffs would all but wipe out growth in the economy for those 2 years. But if we are faced with a prolonged trade conflict, the only way to offset this negative structural change is with a positive structural change. Now, structural policies are appropriately the responsibility of elected governments and parliaments, not the Bank of Canada. So I will tread lightly here. The bank has previously highlighted Canada's productivity challenge, and it's good to see more focus by federal and provincial governments on structural reforms to increase productivity and investment by strengthening our economic union. Removing rules that restrict interprovincial trade or harmonizing or mutually recognizing provincial regulations could provide some offset to the increased trade friction with the United States. Provinces could also make it easier for workers to move within Canada by mutually recognizing different labor accreditations. There is also scope for all levels of government to reduce the timelines and uncertainty related to regulatory approvals. And better east-west transportation links would make trade within Canada less expensive and help get Canadian products to overseas